All right, welcome to chapters 18 and 19, talking about speciation and evolution of populations. When we think about the term evolution, I want you to think about changing. So when we talk about evolution, we're talking about how things change over time. A lot of different things can evolve. If you think about cell phones, when cell phones first came out, it was like you were calling in a drone strike or something like that, and they had this huge bag and this huge phone attached with a cord, and it weighed 20 pounds, and you just carried it around everywhere. There was no thought of being able to put a cell phone in your pocket. And now we've got cell phones that have foldable screens, and you can video message and do all these different things that when cell phones first came out, it was kind of, still considered science fiction. When you talk about computers, where the original computers filled entire rooms and entire floors of buildings, and now your cell phone is stronger than the computers that were originally developed. So things change over time. Whether or not you're talking about bacteria, like the bacterial video from Harvard that's in your discussion board this week, where you had bacteria mutating and adapting to different levels of antibiotics over time, or whether or not you're talking about how a particular population, how its genes shift and change according to the selective pressures that are out there. So when you see the term evolution, don't let it get sensationalized. Just understand when we're talking about evolution, and specifically evolution of populations, we are literally just talking about a change in genes within a population over time. All right, so that's what we're looking at. How do we know things have changed in that population? Why do things change? And what are the pressures that are causing the genes that are available in a population to change over time? All right, looks like I got lots of title pages. All right, here we go. By natural selection. Natural selection is the theory, the idea that was proposed, actually was proposed by both Charles Darwin and a gentleman named Alfred Wallace. If you're interested in this, you can look up things about the Wallace line, where he noticed that populations at this particular latitude are different from populations at this particular latitude. And then, of course, Charles Darwin of the two is the more recognizable name, but both of them have described in their own ways natural selection. We might also know natural selection as the concept of survival of the fittest. And when it comes to natural selection and survival of the fittest, the concept says that if a particular individual has a particular trait that makes it more successful at survival, and therefore gives it the opportunity to reproduce, then those traits are going to be passed on. So if I have a trait and it makes me sexier to the other individuals within my group, if it makes me stronger and more likely to survive, if it makes me a better gatherer or a better hunter, and I am able to survive, then my genes are more likely to go on to the next generation, because for some reason I am more attractive or more fit, and therefore I'll have more of an opportunity to reproduce and send my genes on to the next generation. Now, what they have found, that over time, if you've got bird A, and bird A is really good at cracking walnuts, and you've got bird B who's really good at cracking acorns, and you have an acorn year, that bird B is going to survive, and bird B's genes are going to be passed on. And eventually that population will be a lot more like bird B than bird A, and that population is going to be a lot more able to crack acorns than walnuts. And as long as there's a lot of acorns, that population is able to shift genetically in that direction. So sometimes this benefit, this favorable trait that allows them to survive and reproduce, will lead to changes in that population over time. So when you look at the population's genetics, when you look genetically, a population after a lot of adaptation, after a lot of natural selection, their physical traits or the genetic traits will look different than perhaps it did 50 years earlier. Now, this is based off 3 principles. So when we talk about natural selection, survival of the fittest, inheritance, and genes, and I realize we don't really get into the down and dirty of genetics in this class, but we understand that there are traits that we inherit from our parents. So the first principle is there are characteristics that are inherited from our parents. Okay? My daughter is often referred to as my mini-me. She looks just like you, Leanne, and she does. She looks just like me because my traits, my characteristics were passed on to her. Sometimes those traits and characteristics might be traits and characteristics that allow for better survival. And if they allow for better survival, then overall, better survival means better chance at reproduction, means a change in the population. Sometimes the natural selection is occurring because more offspring are produced and those offspring are able to survive. I read that backwards. Let me try that again. I'll even erase, starting over. Sometimes the principle means that we have more offspring than resources, right? And if we have more offspring than resources, some are going to live and some are going to die. When it comes to nature, it is very brutal. It's all about eating, surviving, reproducing. And if you cannot survive, if you cannot find food, if you cannot find shelter, and you're not able to live, you're not reproducing. So the organisms that are able to live, their genes are being passed on to the next generation, right? And then often offspring vary from one another. Good Lord, don't we all know this? Offspring vary from one another. I am very similar in looks to my sister, but we act very, very differently. My husband is a twin. Fraternal, but twin. So they look very differently. They act very differently. Right? I definitely am a match for my husband, not really a match for my brother-in-law. All right, so offspring vary from each other in characteristics, and a lot of times those characteristics can be inherited. My husband is 6'5". My brother-in-law is 6 foot. My son is 6'3" currently at age 15. So he's probably inherited height from his father because I'm 5'8". So those characteristics are passed on to those offspring. All right? So offspring that inherit characteristics that allow them to best survive. So we're surviving, we're competing, and then we're going to have offspring and passing on traits to the next generation. Those are the offspring that will continue to pass on traits and continue to pass on traits until eventually that gene pool is made up of those traits. So when we talk about evolution, evolution doesn't occur at the individual level. Changes in population don't occur at the individual level. They occur at the population level over time. So just because bird 1 is able to survive doesn't mean that evolution's occurred. It doesn't mean that the population's changed. But because bird 1 is able to survive, they'll reproduce and make 1A and 1B. And they'll reproduce, right? And they'll make 1C, 1D, 1E, 1F. And then eventually the entire population is going to be a population that has a majority of the one trait. And you'll see that that trait gets passed on to generation, and then the population at some point, if it's a trait that's beneficial, is going to have a lot of it. So evolution doesn't occur at the individual level. Individuals do not adapt. Populations adapt. Individuals survive, reproduce, and that allows for populations to adapt. So, natural selection can only take place if there's variation within the population. If everyone in the population has the same set of genes, the same set of DNA, there's nothing to select for, right? That DNA either works or it doesn't work. There's no selecting for green skin versus selecting for red skin because everyone has the same. So there has to be genetic differences. And there's a couple of different ways that we can get genetic differences. Sometimes our DNA will mutate. It doesn't mutate at a very high rate, but it does mutate because during the DNA replication process, sometimes errors occur. Sometimes those mutations can be beneficial and make things work better for those organisms. Sometimes the mutations aren't beneficial. And then another way of introducing variation is through sexual reproduction, because during sexual reproduction, where you have two parents donating DNA to an offspring, it's like you're shuffling a deck of cards, where you have a parent A who has all black cards, and you have parent A or B that has all red cards, and they each donate half of their cards to those offspring. Offspring is going to receive half black, half red. So their deck is different than the original parent's deck, and that introduces variation. When you have differences in that population, when you have genetic differences, now you can have adaptations. Adaptations are traits that allow for survival and reproduction in the current environment. So according to what's going on right now, if I have this particular trait, I'm going to be able to survive. And like we said, if we can survive, then we can reproduce, and then eventually the population may change over time. Favorable traits depend on what's going on right now. So there might be traits out in nature currently that were favorable 50 years or 100 years or 1,000 years ago, but may not necessarily be favorable now. Like wisdom teeth. Anyone ever wonder why we have wisdom teeth? They're considered a vestigial, I think I spelled that right, vestigial, I'm not real sure about that I, vestigial organ. We have a few vestigial organs in the appendix that is thought to be a vestigial organ, but essentially what we're saying is, at one time in our past, wisdom teeth were helpful. That's why we have them. But over time, maybe they're not as helpful. But we still have this trait. We still have this characteristic. The majority of people still get wisdom teeth, but we don't necessarily need them anymore. So that's an example of a trait that might have been favorable at the time, but still in the population now. Sometimes those traits will eventually disappear, and sometimes they just hang around. All right. Different traits can be selected because of the environmental conditions that are present. So what might be selected during hot and dry could be completely different from what is selected for in cold and wet. There are different ways that populations can change over time. Populations can diverge in their characteristics and traits. So this divergent evolution is when species will evolve or change in different directions because of different selective powers. And the example that's put forth right here is the different types of flowers that are available on plants. So there are structures in all plants that allow for reproduction. And that's like your stamen and your pollen and your ovary and your pistil and all that stuff. We learned about it in I don't know what, 5th grade science, I think. But these reproductive structures have changed over time to either be specific to a pollinator or specific to a pollination type. And the flowers are reflective of that. So if you're talking about like the pollination of grasses, which every spring, like in May, the fescue starts blooming, that grass starts blooming, the pollen just blows across the field and drives everyone's allergies nuts. Grasses tend to be pollinated by wind. But when you look at flowers like you have in this picture right here, flowers tend to be pollinated by organisms, insects, sometimes animals. But so they have characteristics that make them more attractive to different pollinators. And because of these different characteristics, they are allowed to reproduce, and that characteristic that it has gets kind of reinforced. So if we're talking about this bird of paradise right here, it's kind of a crazy looking flower, but there is something about the characteristic of the bird of paradise that attracts the birds to pollinate it. And because the birds are pollinating it, it's allowing reproduction to occur. So this characteristic of this flower, this crazy bird shape of this flower, gets passed on to the next generation because, hey, it was successful. We have reproduction, and now we have more of those traits. So what works for the bird of paradise may not necessarily work for, let's see if I know any of these other flowers. This daisy. So what works for one may not work for another. But over time, different forms have evolved or come about because of their success in gaining pollination. Another type of evolution is convergent. And this is where you end up with similar traits, but they are developed for different reasons, or they're developed in different ways. So with divergent, you have one trait that gets developed into all these different types of traits. And with conversion, you have a trait, and there might be several different ways that we get to that trait. So when you talked about wings in bats and wings in insects, they're both wings. They both allow for flight, but they weren't necessarily achieved in the same manner. There were different selection pressures that made that mammal population develop those wings over time. I mean, if you ever think about what was that first bat? What did it look like? How did those traits over time change? Like talk about food and food traits and selective pressures. If you look at the Renaissance paintings and the fruits in the Renaissance paintings, you'll find there's a really famous painting. I don't know what it's called, but look up like Renaissance watermelon painting, right? And you see this watermelon, and it's got a lot of rind in it. It doesn't have a lot of red or pink flesh, and it has tons of seeds in it. It doesn't look like what we would recognize as a watermelon. But over time, there's been selective pressure that has allowed farmers, like, well, maybe they had a watermelon that has less seeds. Oh, that's better. Or maybe you had a watermelon that has more flesh, so there's more that you can eat. So over time, selective pressures have brought forward different characteristics, right? So the ways that this can occur is that they can diverge into separate species or separate flower types, like the brassica do, where you have cauliflower and broccoli and Brussels sprouts. I want to say mustard, maybe. I'm not real sure. But like cauliflower, broccoli, and Brussels sprouts are all from the same species of plant. But they're different types of that species. Where with broccoli, we're focusing on growing flowers. And with cauliflower, you're focusing on growing a different part of the plant. I sound really educated today. But that's an example how different selective pressures allow for divergence. And then convergence is when you end up with the same trait for different reasons, or you end up with the same trait that gives you the same characteristics, but they're in completely different areas, and there were completely different pressures that allowed you for selection. Now, remember, selection is happening at the individual level, but changes occur over many generations. So I don't adapt. I live, I survive, I reproduce. And if those traits that I have allow me to live, survive, and reproduce, then my genes move on to the next generation. And then over time, my population changes. All right, so that leads us to the species concept. Now, the species concept is not really, it's still kind of argued about. What defines a species? What makes one species different from another species? If you're talking about something like bacteria, each bacterial colony can be a different species. The traditional species concept says that if I can no longer reproduce with the original population, I am now a new species. So that's the one that we're going to go with. So groups of individuals that can interbreed and produce fertile, Viable offspring, meaning that if I can interbreed with another organism, sorry about that. Sorry. So if I can interbreed with another organism, then I am of the same species of that organism. If I can interbreed with another organism and my offspring can also have offspring, then I am the same species. If I interbreed with another organism and my offspring cannot have offspring, then I am of a different species. If I cannot interbreed with another organism, I'm a different species. Let's just go over this really quick. If I can breed and then offspring can breed, then yes. If I can breed and offspring cannot, then that's a no. I'm a separate species. I'm not the same species. Different species. And the last one is if I cannot breed, different species. So this is the classic idea of what species are. Like I said, there is some question as to whether or not this is yay or nay, but classically, this is the definition that everyone's calling species, all right? So one species is distinguished from another in nature when it can or cannot breed. So, but sometimes looks are deceiving. So like when you talk about dogs, we all know of the immense variety of dogs that are out there. And a wolfhound looks very, very different from a Chihuahua, but they're the same species. So there's a variety of characteristics and a variety of differences, but technically we're the same species. Now, can a Chihuahua carry a wolfhound pup? Probably not. Could a wolfhound carry a Chihuahua pup? Possibly. All right. But don't let looks deceive you into thinking that they are the same species or the different species, because when you look at these birds right here, they look very, very similar, but they are not the same species, where you have the bald eagle and the African fish eagles. Now, I have bald eagles living on my farm, and these both look like bald eagles to me. But there are differences, externally, differences internally, and that makes them different species. They cannot interbreed and have offspring. When you have offspring of two species that result in an so when two different species result in an offspring, they're called hybrids. Typically, these hybrids are infertile, and that's why we know they cannot have offspring. So that's why we know they're different species. So like a tiger and a liger, or a tiger and a lion, and we get that liger, that's not a fertile offspring. Mules are an example, the classic example between a donkey and a horse. They're infertile, they're hybrids. All right, so how do species form? So when species form, you have an example of changes in the genetics of a population over time, and those changes are to the point where the original population is no longer the same as the new population. So in order for speciation to occur, you have to have two populations form from at least one original population. Now, those two populations could be the original population and a new population, but it's impossible for the resulting populations to come back and interbreed. So those populations separate enough that we're no longer the same. All right. Allopatric speciation is when this occurs because of a geographical separation of populations. So something in the environment has changed so that the populations are separated and then genetically change over time, and they can no longer interbreed. Now, this geographic event, the environmental event, it does not cause the change. It only causes the separation. And then as a result, over time, those populations change. And then you have sympatric speciation. It's when everything stays in the same location. You don't have an environmental change. You just, you have organisms that might be more beneficial or able to reproduce at certain times, and eventually there's no competition there, and you have speciation. All right. So talking specifically about allopatric speciation is when you have that geographic separation that results in population change. Sometimes the geographic separation is an environmental condition, so a change in climate, change in resources, predators and competitors. So if you have a lot of competitors, you might see a population shift over time away from that competition, so there's more resource availability. If something has happened and now all of a sudden we don't have access to our resources, then that can possibly change the population over time. Isolation, or the separation of a group into two different groups, can happen in different ways. So you could have a change in the river flow, a path, a roadway. Erosion can come in and wipe things out or build things up. So if you have erosion come in and pull off a bunch of topsoil, that soil's got to end up somewhere, and maybe that place where it ends up blocks the movement of an organism from one area to another. Traveling into new areas without ways to return. When we talk about traveling to new areas without a way to return, or a change in a flow or a path, tigers in India tend to live in pods. So you would have like a pod here and a pod here and a pod here, and in between the pods you have connections, all right, or pathways. So the tiger might move from pod A to pod B, and you might move from pod B to pod C and C to pod A, and you see that movement. And that's one of the ways that there's variation is maintained in that tiger population, is because they have the ability to move from area to area. But if we come in and we change that environment, and we break off this connection between A and B, right? So now the population doesn't have the freedom of movement that it had before. So there might be tigers that move back and forth right here, but never get over here because they just kind of stroll back and forth. You might have tigers that move back and forth right here, but never get over here. So eventually, this tiger population might see a change from this tiger population, just because we lost that pathway from A to B. Okay? So there's a lot of different ways that isolation can occur and cause disruption in the movement of genes through a community. When a few members of a species move to a new geographical area, then those organisms, those individuals that are in that new area, are kind of colonizing that area, and the traits that they arrived with are going to be the traits that develop the population. So you might see a new population with all of these traits that is different from the original population. Right? And then vicariance is when a natural situation arises that physically divides organisms. So maybe you had a natural bridge between two areas, and that bridge collapsed. Those rocks collapsed down, and now there's no pathway between those two areas. The further the distance is between the original population and the new population, the more likely speciation will occur. All right, let me see if I got a... Nope, I don't. So let's draw it out. Okay? So the further you are from the original population and the new population, the more speciation will occur. So let's say we have a continent, and that continent is right here, right? The continent, and we have individual A, and we have individual B, and we have individual C, right? And then over here, we've got an island here, an island here, and a highland here. A, B, and C can very easily move to this island. Very easily. So the genes on this island can move back and forth. So if we're talking about island number 1, there may not be much difference in the genetics of the organisms on island 1 in the continent because it's easy for them to move, right? Let's move this one over here. It makes my point a little bit easier to understand. All right. We move into island number 2. It's a little bit further. So maybe A and B can reach island number 2, but C can't reach it. All right, so that makes the genes of population number 2 on island number 2 a little bit different from the population at 1, because C can get to 1, but C can't get to 2. And if we're talking about population all the way down here to island number 3, it takes a lot to get to island number 3. So maybe individuals from 1 can't get there. So we can't get here. That won't work, it's too far. But it's close enough to individuals from 2 that we can have movement. And those genes can move over. So the further we get, the more likely you're going to have differences. So the individuals on population 3 are going to be very different from the individuals on the continent, just because it takes a stronger, more resistant individual to be able to travel that far and spread their genes that direction. All right? So when we talk about speciation, we have to talk about allopatric speciation. And allopatric speciation kind of deals with our last slide where we were drawing the different ways that these birds can move throughout the continent and the islands. Adaptive radiation occurs when a population moves throughout an area. And when they get to that new area, so we have population A, and then population A goes to 1, it goes to 2, and it goes to 3, right? And maybe in population 1, this area focuses, if we're talking about birds, on big nuts, insects, seeds, birds, eggs. So that population over time will develop beaks that allow them to open that. But maybe population 2 has a lot of flowers in it, right? So we got a lot of flowers. Let's draw a flower here. Yeah, lots of flowers. And so population 2 develops birds that have the long beaks that can go into flowers. So adaptive radiation is basically where we go into new areas, and some areas favor certain characteristics and other areas favor other characteristics. And then over time, through multiple generations, those characteristics become prevalent. This can result in a lot of different speciation effects because you might develop a new species here, a new species here, and a new species here because they all have different environmental factors. Now, sympatric speciation occurs when there are no physical barriers between a population. So we're not talking about changes in climate or changes in environment. What we're talking about is issues that have at the chromosomal level and issues that happen at the reproductive level. So in cell division, you're supposed to equally divide your genes into 2 new cells. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and the whole set goes one way or the other. All right. Sometimes you end up with cells that have too many, like this one, or too few, like this one, chromosomes. And that can affect that population's ability to pass the traits that are on those chromosomes to the next generation. Sometimes you have populations where organisms have more than one set of chromosomes, have an extra set of chromosomes. So all organisms should have 2 sets. One from your mom and one from your dad. Sometimes you might have organisms with 3 sets or 4 sets. We see this especially in commercial plants. The more sets of chromosomes a plant tends to have, the larger the plant, the more vigorous the plant is. So when we talk about polyploidy in plants, like you think about like bananas, I think have 4 copies, and I want to say commercial strawberries have 8 copies of genes. So instead of having 2 copies, they'll have multiple copies. And that makes for bigger strawberries and bigger bananas and stronger plants and allows them to survive. That can change the genetics of that population over time, right? Sometimes your reproductive isolation isn't because of a physical barrier. I can't actually reach that reproductive partner, but because of the structures themselves, the organisms themselves. So a pre-zygotic barrier is I cannot physically go through the act of reproduction. All right? So something before is occurring that's keeping me from going through that act. And then a post-zygotic barrier is after the zygote or after the fertilization occurs, and maybe there's something that's allowing that organism or keeping that organism from being able to carry to term. So examples of pre-zygotic barriers: I cannot physically get the reproduction to occur. Temporal isolation. So maybe frog number one likes to reproduce from January to March, while frog number two reproduces from March to May. So they're just not in the same reproductive schedule. And if we're not in the same reproductive schedule, we're not going to reproduce with each other. Therefore, we have a barrier between the two populations. Habitat isolations. So we're no longer interacting with each other. Behavioral isolations. So maybe there's a behavior that's missing that makes me not want to reproduce with you, or maybe you have a behavior that is new that makes me interested and more likely to want to reproduce with you. This leads to mating rituals and sexual selection, which are fascinating. Gametic barrier, maybe my gametes or maybe our reproductive structures will not interact. Maybe that pollen will not be able to fertilize that particular egg because they just don't connect. Maybe it's the physical structures that are allowing for the reproduction don't work with each other. And then hybrid inviability. Maybe all of the things work correctly and we are able to reproduce, but our offspring are hybrids that are infertile. And so that doesn't count. All right. So we got frog A likes January to March, and frog B, March to May. Therefore, except for that brief interval in March, we have two separate populations. All right. Habitat isolation. This particular cricket likes a dry, sandy soil. This one likes green. If I like green, I'm not going to go to the dry, sandy soil and interact with that organism and reproduce, and vice versa. I'm only going to interact with the organisms in the areas that I want to be in. The damselfly. So the reproductive structures, look at the differences in the reproductive structures of these damselflies. Can you imagine being the organism whose reproductive structure looks like this and trying to reproduce with the organism whose reproductive structure looks like that? Right? They just don't interact. They don't match. There is no give and take there because that puzzle piece won't fit. All right. So that can be a barrier to the ability of those organisms to pass their genes on to the next generation. And then population variation. Individuals within a population show differences, and the distribution of those differences can change over time because of different pressures. And can cause those to change over time. So maybe we have a batch of kittens and mom says I can only pick one. I have to get rid of the others. Well, if I pick this one, the next generation of kittens are going to look like that one. And if I pick this one, the next generation of kittens are going to look like that one. So just the fact that I have to choose one and only that one individual will pass on genetics within my population, it can change the look of the population over time. So different pressures can cause the variation, and that will change and shift what that population looks like. Traits can sometimes be beneficial for organisms. So maybe this trait is selected and now we're doing great, or maybe it's harmful. This trait is selected and we don't want that trait, so we're going to move away from that trait. This trait over here is harmful, so let's make sure that we're not choosing organisms that have that trait to pass it on. Genetic drift is an example of how selection and organisms can change populations over time. Two different things we're going to look at. The first is a bottleneck effect. The bottleneck effect is just saying there is something that is limiting the number of organisms that can survive. So let's say there's a natural disaster, such as the hurricane. So maybe this is the hurricane that just hit Louisiana. And it's decreased the number of insect A in the population. So now we have pink and peach and green insect A's in that population, and we no longer have the red insect A's. So just the ones that are left over from that natural disaster, they're the only ones that are alive, so they're the only ones that are going to be able to pass on genes, and then the population reflects that. And then the founder effect is kind of like what we talked about with our islands again. Not all organisms are going to move to the new area. Only the ones that move to the new area are going to establish that population and the genetics in that population. In this case, the new area doesn't get the little white butterfly because they just never went there. They never founded a population in that new area. Sometimes genes can flow back and forth from area to area because of migration of individuals or migration of gametes. So when we talk about migration of gametes, think about plants. When that fescue grass blooms and the pollen moves across the field, I mean, that's a migration of a gamete. That pollen is a sex cell for that plant. Or we could have an individual that is moving. When that happens, it can change the structure of where those individuals are going. So it will affect the structure of the new area. So if this little bug goes over here, they're going to introduce brown traits into this population of green bugs, and the population will reflect that after several generations. We talked about one of the ways that we can introduce variation into a population as being mutation. Mutations are random changes in an organism's DNA. We are capable of forcing mutations. This is one of the ways that we've adapted plants in agriculture over time, where we force the mutation with chemicals, or we might force the mutation with radiation. And as a result, they've been able to develop particular types of foods. But mutations occur naturally. Organisms are constantly mutating. You might have mutations in your thumb of your right hand that makes the genes in the thumb of your right hand just a little bit different from the genes in the big toe of your left foot. Their mutations are occurring all the time. Sometimes those mutations can be beneficial, and they make me more likely to survive and therefore reproduce. Sometimes they can be harmful. Maybe that mutation occurs in I now have traits that make me less likely to reproduce. When we talk about mutation, mutations have to happen in the gametes or the sex cells in order for them to be passed on to the next generation. If the mutation happens in my right thumb, that's not going to be passed on to the next generation because there are not gametic cells in my right thumb that reproduce and make new organisms. The mutation has to occur in the gametes, the sex cells, in order to be passed on to the next individual. Neutral mutations tend to stay within a population because they're not really beneficial, they're not really harmful, so there's really no selective pressure for or against them, they just kind of hang out. Non-random mating, sexual selection. If you are interested in something about sexual selection, it's really kind of fascinating. The different traits that have developed because of mate choice, whether you're talking about humans, peacocks, deer, sexual selection because I'm a good fighter. So I want to choose the best fighter because obviously they're strong and they have strong genes and I want the strong genes for my offspring. So I'm going to meet with that individual. Or maybe, especially when it comes to birds, you see that showy sexual selection where the peacocks have their big feathers, or you might have a bird that does a dance and they dance just the right way. And you're thinking, well, that guy must be fit. And so the female chooses that individual. Sexual selection tends to be towards the males, where the females are selecting the males, but it can occur the other way around. So it can lead to natural selections for traits that are favorable to the opposite sex. And so over time, the peacock gets showier. Because when you think about it, that peacock's tail feathers make it, those tail feathers are risky for it to have. It makes it slower, it makes it harder for it to move. But there must be enough benefit for that organism to maintain such a showy group of feathers that the cost-benefit ratio there, even though it's expensive, it must be beneficial enough for those genes to be passed on from generation to generation. All right. So in assortative mating, preference of mating occurs with individuals that are similar to themselves. So not only can we choose individuals that might have traits that are attractive. Ooh, I want my offspring to be strong, so I'm going to choose the burliest one, or the biggest antlers, or the greatest fighter, or the biggest showman. But also, this organism looks like me, looks like my population, acts in the same way, so I'm going to select them because they're similar. So sexual selection is very fascinating. And then environmental variances. So things that happen in our environment can cause over time changes in the organism. So for instance, suntans are the result of increased UV light exposure. So individuals that are exposed to populations, because evolution doesn't occur at the individual level, adaptation doesn't occur at the individual level, occurs at the population. Populations that are exposed to high amounts of UV light over time are going to be populations that are able to protect themselves from that UV light through development of a suntan. Suntans are a protective factor against UV radiation. So you tend to find populations closer to the equator that have greater amounts of sunlight tend to have greater amounts of melanin production, and populations that are closer to the poles that have lower amounts of sunlight tend to have lower melanin production and don't tan as much. Now that's historically. Currently we have a very global and mobile population, so you see people of all colors in all areas, and it is a beautiful thing. But other environmental factors can affect other organisms. So when you talk about turtles and reptiles, sometimes simply the temperature at which the eggs are incubated at which the organisms are developing at, can determine whether or not you have males or females. So if you only develop males during cold weather and you have a warm climate, now we have a population of all females, and it's hard for that population to continue sending their genes on to the next generation. So not only is it what our environment does to us, but also how we can use that environment and allows us to survive. So after all of this time, because I realize I've been talking a long time, and I apologize for that. If I were to summarize this lecture in one sentence, it would be: populations change over time because certain characteristics allow for survival, and if you can survive, you can reproduce. If you have any questions, just send me an email, get a hold of me. I'm happy